Pounds County Public Safety. How may I help you?
Yes, a person just woke me up and swears that she found her severed head of her son in the basement.
Can I talk to her?
Hello?
Can you tell me what's going on?
Great President, my son's head is in a bucket in my basement.
What is your son's name?
Sad Syrian.
When's the last time you saw your son?
He was here a couple hours, then he left with Taylor.
Who's that?
Girl, Taylor.
Where's that?
Go right there. Look right, there's a bucket with a towel on it.
Dude, it is. Hold on, just. That's real, right? That's real, dog. We're gonna need more units here.
When you see butchery like this in murder cases, it does suggest that the individual who perpetrated this violence had some sadistic tendencies or sadistic fantasies that they were able to carry out. This is not a typical murder.
Hi, Taylor. How's it going?
Contact.
Taylor, you have a warrant for your arrest. Just put your hands behind your back. You got blood on your hands here too. No, on your hands.
She's kind of nonchalant. She doesn't seem to be concerned, fearful, suspicious of the police. She's standing there in a relatively calm state. So that's different than most people would be if they're alarmed because they think something bad happened.
Well, a few hours ago, police were dispatched to an address on Stony Brook. The parents' house, Shad Syrian. You know Shad? And how do you know Shad?
He's my ex.
He's your ex-boyfriend? Well, they found a kind of disturbing stuff at the house there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of blood. Basically Shad's head.
If you're speaking with a police officer and he says, hey, this person you know, they found some disturbing things, and the first thing he says is a lot of blood, I mean, the natural reaction for any person is gonna be, oh my gosh, is he okay? Or something along those lines. So even though the pause before he gets to the even more shocking phrase of severed head, you can see, again, no reaction.
So what we do know about Taylor Shabusiness is that in the past, she has exhibited a number of behaviors and had a number of experiences. First, she has exhibited assaultive behavior towards other students in high school. We know that she's done drugs. We know that she is not free of a behavioral history of being able to be aggressive and hostile and violent. So all those things would be on a differential to try and sort out about what's going on with her and what happened with Shad.
Well, they found part of Shad At his house, or his mom's house. Found his head. Where's the rest of his body?
It's there. It's at his house.
Well, tell me what happened.
It's a good question because I blacked out during that time.
Where did you find the vehicle?
I was right there by the bed.
By the bed, you did it?
Yeah, I was cuddling it by the bed.
What?
I was cuddling it by the bed.
Okay. You start to remember now what happened with Shad? What do you remember so far?
Well, there's this chain thing, right? And then, yeah, like I was playing around with it. And he put it around his neck while we were like playing around and then, I don't know, I was tugging on it and then,
You have any mental health issues we should be aware of?
I don't know yet.
It's curious that when they ask her about her mental health history, she states that she doesn't know yet. Makes me wonder if she's trying to set the stage to be able to avoid or mitigate her responsibility in this crime.
That's very typical of individuals with psychopathy in that they don't want to give too many details early on because they're still trying to figure out how they're going to spin the story.
And so there was a chain.
I think it's on a dresser. It's just weird. I got like a weird flashback.
What did you see?
It was weird. I was riding him like a donkey.
So would this be considered foreplay?
Yeah, it was. And then I just didn't stop. I don't know why. I didn't stop.
Do you use manual strangulation during sex at all? The Shad like that?
A manual strangulation? Yes.
But does anybody like strangle the other person?
Mainly me. I like doing it a lot. I like doing it to somebody else.
She's framing it right now as we were both into this thing, the strangulation. But as the story goes on, it becomes much more clear that this was an interest that she had prior to that evening. It's something that she's enjoyed before, and it's something she planned on doing. And it's not something particularly that maybe Shad was into. Shad suffered from depression. It might make him more vulnerable to believing that she cared about him, and then he would become more easily manipulated so that she could use him for whatever reason she needed.
Research has shown some correlation between psychopathy and sadistic behavior. She's describing it as if it was a consensual activity. But we know that ultimately she not only murdered him, but then dismembered him in a very vile way. So there's certainly some sadistic behavior that took place at her hands.
Was anybody home? Did you encounter anybody? I understand his mom lives here.
Tara?
Tara?
Is that the mom's name?
Yes.
Damn, the head. Yeah, I can't believe that.
Where'd you do the body?
The body's there.
So we're gonna take the head somewhere?
I like that. I wanted the head.
So you dismembered the body too?
Yeah. They're gonna have fun trying to look for all the organs. But yeah, they're all dismembered.
And what did you do with the body?
Absolutely in the basement. And then I know I forgot the head. I wanted the head.
Did you bring anything with you?
Yeah, it's in the van. I think it's a foot.
She's almost completely detached from humanity as she's describing it. Even the fact that his mother found his head, the fact that this was someone she had a relationship with, it's her ex-boyfriend. And she's describing his dismembered body parts, again, almost with pride. And I think that the way that she states that is rather chilling and shows that there is truly no remorse and association with his human life.
How did you dismember his body?
Nice.
Where'd you get those from?
Kitchen. My mind, I wasn't sharp enough.
You weren't sharp?
No. It was alright. Redneck looks good.
Bread knife?
I was getting pissed off at the dismemberment process, actually. Why didn't have that? I had fun with him for that 2 hours and then boom.
Where would these knives be now?
They're in with all the organs and all the body parts. I took a red next to a pink and black backpack that Shaq gave me. So I left it there.
Her descriptions are really clear. She's identifying items, color, where they are, what kind of knives. So she's now getting very specific, and also making some of the comments, they almost sound like dark humor. She's already throwing in little allusions to what's to come for the police officer.
Before you chain went around his neck, were you and Chad like kissing or any foreplay?
No, we were chilling at home. I was gonna walk him like a dog.
And he wanted that?
I have no idea. What am I gonna do it anyway? I was strangling. I was having fun with that. Oh, I still felt his heartbeat, right?
You did?
I did. So I kept on pulling more and more and more, and I went back in. Almost like he wouldn't die. I was like, dang.
So when did you realize that Chad was not alive anymore?
You know, his face turned purple. He was coughing up bloody. I still didn't stop. I don't know what was going on. And I'm like,
So you wanted him to die?
I didn't want him to die, actually. He's my buddy, but like it happened.
Oh, blood's going out of his mouth. What'd you do?
Clean him up a little bit. And then, I just played with him. And I just cuddled him and hugged him.
Shabusiness seems quite interested in control and domination. That's clear from when she even talks about walking him like a dog or riding him like a donkey. By ultimately strangling him until he died, she created a play object for her. We know from the records that she actually engaged in necrophilic acts with his body. She was again in complete control now that she had killed him.
So you realized that by continuing that you may actually kill him?
I swear to God, he was telling me, he's just like, so I'm like, and I did it.
You know, did it make you happy? It was just kind of exciting.
Like, this is the thing that I have, like, I've always had, you know, like, you ever love something so much that you kill it?
Okay.
Like, it happens to me. That's the feeling that I have. I love something so much that I kill it.
Was it sexually exciting to you when you were choking Chad?
Yeah. Very. Boom.
People People often wonder, what's the association between sexual arousal, violence? And she words it, you love something so much, you want to kill it. What we do know from a neurophysiologic standpoint, that extreme states of arousal, extreme states of rage have a similar neurochemistry. And so we think that in some people, that's why the two can get paired. Some people can find it emotionally a turn on when there's violence, and when there's violence occurring, it's arousing to them.
Why you knew that you didn't want to call the police or an ambulance?
Actually, I thought about it. And then I was getting angry at myself. Very angry at myself. I didn't have the proper tools. Sucks not having it.
And what do you think should happen if someone does something like this to somebody else?
I don't know. They obviously get prison time.
A 24-year-old woman charged in one of Brown County's most gruesome homicides is found competent to stand trial by a doctor. But the case against Taylor Shabusiness is not moving forward just yet.
Instead, another psychiatric evaluation is being allowed before a judge decides what to do next.
You went off on your attorney, Taylor. You went crazy on your attorney.
You can't do that here.
When she's in the courtroom, she notices cameras, she can play to the camera, she can smirk, she can interact. And so it's almost, if I can't put my expert on, I'll go ahead and attack my attorney and show people I'm crazy. I think it's deliberate, because she's feigning the confusion, like that's not how the psychiatric illness would manifest itself.
When you were reviewing the phone itself, the extraction of the phone itself on March 2nd of 2022, did you note any searches related to Jeffrey Dahmer?
24 total searches, such things like Jeffrey Dahmer walking into court all sexy.
And did you likewise see any photographs of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yes, there's a picture of Jeffrey Dahmer on the screen of the cell phone, and she's smiling like they're taking a selfie together.
When we look at her fascination, her obsession with Jeffrey Dahmer, it's almost like a role model for her, like someone she wants to be like or emulate. Jeffrey Dahmer, when he killed people, he liked to dismember them, keep the body parts, he liked to save the head, and she's emulating that ideal.
You meet a person in school, you say he's your friend, you become friends, become girlfriend, boyfriend, lovers, gain his trust. An innocent person that's very kind, would do anything for you. And I believe you used that, and you had this plan, and took your opportunity when you did. There's no excuse, I don't see it no other way. I will pray that you meet the same fate as your idealistic Jeffrey Dahmer.
May the jury find the defendant, Taylor Denise Shabusiness, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide.
You figure he's okay? I like to think he is. somebody hurt him, they'll find him who did it. So, if you know of somebody that got pissed off at him or something.
It's the thing, we're new up here. We honestly haven't met anybody besides my family.
I found a pair of pants. I found like a jacket, a coat, shoes. It stunk really bad. And I swore I seen a bone in there.
Authorities say residents at this duplex on North 22nd Street contacted police after finding burnt clothing, sneakers, and human remains inside a garbage can. The burnt material matches what John Swain had been wearing when he was last seen. Another resident returned home from vacation to find bloodstains on her rug.
What do you know about Theo?
I mean, I've known about him, but I don't know him.
Oh.
Left him up here, she left him. Go home.
Okay. Why'd she leave him?
And when she told me, she said that he was gonna kill her brother, and she left.
We have a missing person from Bismarck, okay? We have some items that were at the apartment that you were staying at. We identified those items as being worn by that missing person.
Okay, so am I being charged with anything, or?
Right now, no.
I mean, I wouldn't be too comfortable talking about this without a lawyer, present.
Here's the deal, Theo. I want you to think about this, okay? This kid has family that is desperately looking for him, that are concerned for him.
Crow communicates a great deal by his body language. We have an individual being interrogated by two detectives who's cool as a cucumber. So that gives us a good window in terms of just how devoid of emotion he is and how unworried he is.
Theo, he got kicked out of my mom's house for living in here.
Okay. Why did you get kicked out of your mom's house?
He hits my sister.
Okay. So you would have started staying at Megan's. How was that for you guys?
Bad.
Bad. How was that bad?
Well, I didn't work because I felt like I couldn't trust him with my daughter because he was drinking heavily and he got into drugs.
Okay.
And he gets mad really easily.
It seems clear that Donnie is not only afraid of him, but she doesn't trust him with his daughter, and he's hit her sister. This is a very aggressive, violent, versatile criminal who's just doesn't obey the law and doesn't think the rules apply to him.
I'm freaking out, bro.
Why are you freaking out?
Because he killed somebody. He said that he pulled a knife on him. And him and his friend.
I mean, you said you had a buddy there.
They said they did together.
Did you say which friend?
He did tell me his name, but I just don't remember. I think it's like a comment, like a Josh or something like that.
Yeah. I just want to let you guys know I'm going to cooperate fully. I was held at gunpoint. He stayed the night at our apartment. Not really sure why. And then he started getting on everybody's nerves. He was being cool with me, but he was starting with my cousin. So we decided, let's walk to the store and get some beers. He said, I'm gonna go see if we can score some weed. So we walked up to this park. We saw this little Asian kid there. Walked up to him, just started with him, yeah, you wanna grab some beers, come down to my house and hang out. Kid walked down the street, came into the place, we're just chatting with him. And out of nowhere, the guy that I used to work with just came out and hit the kid in the head with a hammer. He says, hey, check this out. Comes around the corner and just...
So, how many times did he hit him?
I'd say at least 4.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I remember one of them, he put the hammer around and the claw and stuck in his head.
They seemingly go out and meet this young boy, 18-year-old John Swain. They lure him back to their house, bashing his head in, and Clark doesn't sound scared or upset. He tells it like he's explaining how he went to the grocery store, which is not what a normal person would do.
On paper, Clark looks a lot cleaner, right? Is very careful in presenting himself as the unwitting witness to Crow's demonic plan. Maybe Clark is just a little bit better at hiding and dissimulating his real intentions and his real acts than Crow is.
I'm like, dude, this is up, man. I pulled out a 10 gauge, or 12, I don't know. Whatever it was, a gun, shotgun, cocked it, put it to my head and said, you can't tell anybody about this. You're gonna help me get rid of this.
What happened to the body, the kid?
He had it in the bathtub.
Mm-hmm.
He took a knife
mm-hmm.
and cut him off at the knee joints. He made me help him wrap it up in a blanket and bring it out to his garage.
Where did you get the hammer from?
Somewhere by the door.
Did you have to help him cut him up?
No, I didn't. I don't think he made me cut him up. I mean, I don't know.
You might not remember what you had for breakfast, right? But you're gonna remember cutting up a body. And the fact that he refers to this human being recently deceased as it is further proof of the objectification of the victim. And that's very consistent with the way a psychopath thinks.
A new development in the case of 18-year-old John Swain. Bismarck police say they got a tip that Swain was buried in the backyard of this Montana home where Theo Crow lives with his mother.
All right. We have a search warrant right here for your DNA.
And speech and privilege is prohibited person.
I guess I'm not sure what you want to talk to me about.
Confession. Sir, I've always been the type to take responsibility, for what I've done.
So we spoke with I believe it was a Joshua Clark that said he was there.
Like I said, I don't know where to begin.
Clark tells us, I'm gonna fully cooperate. Crow says, I'm here to give a confession. Both are vying for control of the interaction with the detectives. They want to get ahead. They want to push their narrative so that they can control the outcome. And that's very psychopathic.
We're pretty drunk. Josh mentioned that he wanted to kill somebody. And I half believed him, half didn't.
Now, and you guys spoke before about it being a random person?
Yeah. We're just gonna walk to cover down somebody. You see just a hammer. And so we had that with us.
Whose hammer was that?
It was Josh's. After we leave my place, we walk towards the school. There's a playground, a basketball court, and like a soccer field. Right across the way. And we ran into this guy.
What was that guy doing?
He was kicking a soccer ball.
I think that the way they went about selecting their victim is illustrative of some pretty significant psychopathic or antisocial tendencies. They identify a younger individual of smaller stature, purposefully choosing somebody who's isolated. It really feels like they view John as almost a pawn in a game that they're playing.
As we were sitting around listening, he was like, Josh, he told me, he said, you started off. Josh is talking to him. John's sitting on the sofa outdoor.
What happened then?
I'm standing there, and I have the hammer in my hand. But it's out of view from them. I turn around, and I hit him. At that point, Josh came over, and I either handed him or he took the hammer, and he started hitting him. I turned away, he hit him 5 to maybe 10 times. You know, just like 10 times, you know, I mean, like, I knew he was dead. Josh goes in the bathroom to wash off the hammer. John was on the couch and there's blood everywhere.
There's not a whole lot of research about whether psychopaths essentially draw each other, but it makes sense. Imagine if you can find somebody who's like you, who wants to go and do these horrible things and doesn't really feel bad about it. If anything, egging each other on and showing each other this is totally okay to be this way.
He's face down. He's face down in the bathtub. Like Josh comes back and he had more than one, like two or three knives. He hands me one and I cut off his right leg at the knee. Josh cut off the left.
Was that difficult to cut him off?
Yeah, it was. I mean, not difficult as in physically, like, it was difficult emotionally, is what I'm trying to say.
He catches himself. In the end, again, he feels compelled to say that it was hard emotionally. I think he had to add that just because he heard himself speak, and it sounded horrible.
We wrapped him up. I said, we can put him in my garage. I knew I was gonna put the body in my mom's truck. I was gonna bury the body in my backyard.
Okay. What happened after that then?
We slept. I slept with a knife by the pillow. I remember I told Josh, I said, don't kill me, you know, while I'm sleeping. And he said, don't kill me.
At the end of the day, even when psychopaths may not know what they are, or they may not recognize it entirely in another person, they still know not to trust each other, because this guy will do the exact same thing to me that I'd be thinking about doing to him.
Now, Josh had said that he didn't do anything at the scene, and that it was all you.
I'm not even the one wanting to do it. You know, I mean, he mentioned it, he brought it up. we use, people out of the weapon. I mean, come on.
When people think of psychopaths, they think they have absolutely no emotion, and that's actually not true. Here we see Crow all of a sudden feeling upset because he feels very bad for himself, feels not at all bad for what they did to John Swain.
$15, $59 hours removing the tarp and bagging it up.
So obviously the reason that you're here today is because they went and talked to Theo. There's a lot of things that were different. Okay. Specifically, he said you guys talked about it beforehand.
I mean, I guess. I mean, we were just saying like how mad we were that we could kill somebody. Just.
Now's your chance to lay it all out there.
The hammer he used, it was my hammer for work. I ended up burying it underneath the concrete footing, just digging a hole before we poured cement on top of it and covered my hammer.
There's nothing you're leaving out?
No. I told the officers that he threatened me with a shotgun, that he actually pulled it out on me. He didn't pull it out on me, he told me he had a sawed-off 12 gauge. I guess he didn't really threaten me with it. One thing that I did leave out when Theo, after he hit him 5 or 6 times, he turns to me, holding the hammer out, and says, "You gonna bitch out?" I said, I just took it from him, and I did it once.
Just once?
Just once.
Yeah, just with the hammer.
Yep. Just
about like that.
Just so that he felt that I wasn't gonna narc on him. That's not the kind of person I am. You can obviously tell that by talking to me and stuff. I mean, I'm not a killer man. Like, I was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I think both Crow and Clark had violent and homicidal fantasies that they brought out in each other, and that partnership allowed them to express desires that they had not had the outlet for in the past.
So at this time you are under arrest for participating in that murder.
Why exactly am I being charged, sir?
You took part in this. Okay?
I didn't.
Okay, even by your own admission.
The debate is constantly, which is the worst psychopath? The factor 2 type psychopath, which is more antisocial. They're typically more violent and aggressive. Or the factor 1 psychopath, who tends to maybe blend in more with society, tends to be more manipulative, charming, cunning, which causes more damage. Which is worse? I would say the factor 1, the type that is more akin to Clark. So I always find the chameleon to be a little more dangerous.
Clark is sentenced to life in prison for his role in the murder of a South Dakota teenager. 20-year-old Joshua Clark was convicted in July for his role in the killing of 18-year-old John Swain. His co-conspirator, 26-year-old Theo Crow, also received life. Though justice was served, Swain's parents, Pat and David, say the brutality of the crime still haunts them.
Because it was senseless. It was so horrible. It was just a total disregard of human life. Because there was no reason. None at all.
Found County Public Safety.
Pretty positive my son's head is in a bucket in my basement.
Hold on, that's real, right?
You ever love something so much that you can't?
Pretty white shoelace to wear on the bed rail, and I tied it around her throat. Where do you leave your wife's body? She was heavy. She's, pregnant.
Turns to me, holding the hammer out, and says, "You gonna bitch out?" I just took it from him and I just with the hammer.
Did you ever tell him, "I want you to hurt or kill your family"?
I did encourage it, yes, I did.
I don't think he made me cut him up. I don't know.
The situation of this looks like I'm a psycho.
July 4th, 1956 was supposed to be an ordinary summer day for the Weinberger family. In Westbury, Long Island, the holiday carried the familiar atmosphere of an American summer. Families gathered, children played, and homes were occupied by the quiet routines of a day away from work. But inside one middle-class home, something happened that would transform an ordinary family into the center of one of the most disturbing kidnapping investigations in American history. The victim was not a wealthy businessman, a public figure, or the child of a famous family. He was a baby. His name was Peter Weinberger, and he was only about 1 month old. Peter had been born on June 2nd, 1956, to Morris and Betty Weinberger. At the time of his disappearance, he was still at the very beginning of his life. He was too young to understand the world around him, too young to speak, and completely dependent on the adults responsible for protecting him. On that July day, Betty placed her infant son in a baby carriage outside the family home. She left him there for only a short period while she went inside. There was nothing about that moment that suggested danger. There was no warning, no confrontation, and apparently no indication that someone was watching. Then Betty returned. The carriage was still there, but Peter was gone. For a parent, there are few discoveries more terrifying than the sudden absence of a child. The object that should have contained a baby was still sitting where it had been placed, but the baby himself had disappeared. And then there was something else. Near the carriage, investigators found a handwritten note written in blue ink. It was not a message from a confused stranger. It was a ransom demand. Someone had taken Peter Weinberger and was demanding money for his return. The amount was $2,000. The kidnapper also made the threat unmistakable. If the family reported the kidnapping or failed to follow the instructions, Peter could be killed. In an instant, the Weinbergers were placed in an impossible position. Their child had been taken, but the person who had taken him was telling them that any attempt to seek help could put his life at even greater risk. The family was being forced to choose between obeying a stranger and trusting the authorities. But there was another reason this case would capture the attention of the country. The Weinbergers were not an extraordinarily wealthy family. There was no obvious reason why a kidnapper should have selected them. The ransom demand was significant, but not connected to some vast fortune. That fact made the disappearance particularly disturbing. If a baby from an ordinary middle-class family could be taken from outside his own home, then the danger suddenly seemed much closer to ordinary American families. The crime challenged a comforting assumption. That kidnapping was something that happened to other people somewhere else, usually because the victims were wealthy or famous. Peter's disappearance suggested something much more frightening. A child could simply be in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The ransom note provided the family with instructions. The kidnapper wanted $2,000 in small denomination bills, placed inside a brown envelope, and left at a specified location near the corner of Albemarle Road and Park Avenue. The instructions were designed to create a controlled exchange. The kidnapper promised that if everything went according to plan, Peter would be returned. But the instructions also carried an implicit warning. The family was expected to obey without hesitation. They were not supposed to involve the police. They were not supposed to alert anyone. They were supposed to trust the person who had taken their infant son. Morris and Betty Weinberger faced the reality that every decision could have consequences for Peter. They reported the kidnapping, but Morris also tried to prevent the case from becoming public. He attempted to persuade newspapers not to publish the story because he feared publicity could frighten the kidnapper and place Peter in even greater danger. The family's hope was simple: keep the situation controlled, recover their son, and bring him home alive. But the case could not remain private for long. A newspaper eventually placed the story on its front page, and the disappearance of the infant became national news. What had begun as a terrifying discovery at one Long Island home was now being watched by people across the United States. The attention brought resources, but it also brought pressure. Investigators had very little to work with. There was no clear photograph of the person responsible. There was no reliable eyewitness account identifying the kidnapper. There was no known license plate connecting a vehicle to the crime. And there was no obvious explanation for why Peter had been chosen. The handwritten ransom note was therefore more than a demand for money. It was one of the few physical traces left behind by the person responsible. The handwriting would eventually become the central clue in the investigation, but at this moment, the investigators did not know where it would lead. All they knew was that somewhere an infant was missing, and someone was demanding money for his return. The first attempt to recover Peter would depend on the kidnapper's instructions. Authorities prepared what appeared to be a ransom payment and arranged for it to be left at the location specified by the kidnapper. It was an opportunity to identify the person responsible and, perhaps, recover Peter. But the exchange did not happen. The kidnapper never appeared to collect the money. Later, after his arrest, Angelo Lamarca would explain why. According to his account, he had driven toward the area while still carrying Peter. But when he saw the presence of police and reporters, he became frightened that he would be discovered. He did not approach the money. Instead, he left. From the perspective of the investigation, the failed exchange was a devastating setback. The authorities still did not have Peter. The family still did not know where their child was. And the person responsible had demonstrated that he was willing to change his plans whenever he believed he was in danger. The first opportunity to bring Peter home had disappeared. Yet the case was only beginning. Over the days that followed, the investigation would become larger and more complicated. New instructions would arrive. Another message would be found. The handwriting would be compared with other samples. And eventually, federal investigators would confront a problem that seemed almost impossible. How do you find one unknown person when the only distinctive clue left behind is the way he writes? At the center of everything was Peter Weinberger, a 1-month-old child whose disappearance had begun with a few minutes of absence and an empty carriage. The investigation would grow to an extraordinary scale. But before the investigators could identify a suspect, they would have to confront uncertainty, failed ransom exchanges, and the passage of time. For Peter's parents, every hour without their son was another hour of fear. For the investigators, every unanswered question was another barrier between the family and the child they desperately wanted to find. And somewhere beyond the immediate panic surrounding the Weinberger home, the person responsible was still free. He had taken a baby almost by chance, demanded money, and then watched his carefully imagined plan begin to collapse. The next stage of the case would reveal just how fragile that plan really was. Peter Weinberger was only about 1 month old when he disappeared, and that simple fact is essential to understanding the human dimension of the case. He was not an older child capable of recognizing danger, remembering a face, or describing what had happened to him. He was an infant who depended entirely on his parents for protection. Peter had been born on June 2, 1956, to Morris and Betty Weinberger, a middle-class family living in Westbury, Long Island, New York. His life before the kidnapping had barely begun. He had spent only a few weeks in the world before an ordinary moment outside his family's home became the beginning of a national investigation. There was no indication in the information surrounding the family that Peter had been singled out because of who his parents were. The Weinbergers were not presented as extraordinarily wealthy or famous. They were an ordinary family whose lives were suddenly interrupted by a crime that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. That detail would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Kidnapping, in the public imagination of the time, could be associated with money, prominence, and families believed to possess the resources to pay enormous demands. But the Weinberger family did not fit that image. The ransom demand was $2,000, a substantial amount, but the family was not known for possessing some extraordinary fortune. The disappearance, therefore, raised a disturbing possibility. Perhaps Peter had not been selected because of his family's status at all. Perhaps he had simply been there. On July 4th, 1956, Peter was placed in a baby carriage outside the Weinberger home. Betty left him there while she went inside for a short period. Nothing in that moment suggested that the child was being watched by someone preparing a carefully organized crime. There was no confrontation and no dramatic struggle described in the available account. When Betty returned, the carriage remained in place, but Peter had vanished. The physical scene was almost painfully simple. The carriage was still there. The baby was not. Near it was a handwritten note in blue ink. That note changed the meaning of the disappearance immediately. If Peter had simply wandered away, the family would have been searching for a missing child. But the note indicated something much worse. Someone had taken him deliberately and was demanding money in exchange for his return. The kidnapper demanded $2,000 and warned the family that Peter could be killed if they reported the crime or failed to follow the instructions. For Morris and Betty Weinberger, this created a terrible contradiction. The natural response to a missing child is to call for help. Yet the person holding their son was telling them that seeking help could place Peter in greater danger. They were being asked to trust someone who had already violated the most fundamental boundary imaginable. He had taken their infant child. The family nevertheless reported the kidnapping. That decision became one of the central realities of the investigation. From that point forward, Peter's safety depended not only on the family's choices, but also on the ability of investigators to understand the kidnapper's behavior and locate him. Morris Weinberger also understood that publicity could complicate the situation. He attempted to persuade newspapers not to publish the story because he feared that widespread attention might frighten the kidnapper. His concern was practical and immediate. If the person holding Peter believed that police were closing in, the consequences could be fatal. Yet the case could not remain hidden. A newspaper eventually placed the story on its front page, and the kidnapping quickly became a national story. The transformation was dramatic. What had begun as a private family catastrophe in Westbury became a case followed by people far beyond Long Island. The public now knew that an infant had been taken from his home and that someone was demanding money for his return. But publicity did not solve the central problem. Investigators still did not know who had taken Peter. There was no clear photograph of the perpetrator. There was no reliable eyewitness who could provide a definitive identification. There was no known license plate connected to the crime. There was also no clear motive beyond the demand for money. The ransom note, therefore, assumed enormous importance. It was one of the few direct pieces of evidence produced by the kidnapper himself. The writing on that paper would eventually become the thread that investigators followed through an enormous number of records. But at this stage, the family could not know that handwriting would become so important. They had only the message and the promise that their son might be returned if they complied. The instructions were specific. The kidnapper demanded $2,000 in small denomination bills and wanted the money placed inside a brown envelope. The designated location was near the corner of Albemarle Road and Park Avenue. The instructions suggested that the kidnapper believed he could control the situation by determining where and how the money would be delivered. He promised that Peter would be returned if everything went according to plan. For the Weinbergers, that promise must have represented the narrow space between despair and hope. The child was still missing, but the kidnapper was communicating. Communication meant there was still an opportunity, at least in theory, to bring Peter home. The authorities therefore prepared for the first attempted ransom exchange. What followed would reveal one of the fundamental weaknesses in the kidnapper's plan. He did not appear to collect the money. According to Lamarca's later account, he had driven toward the designated area while Peter was still with him. But the presence of police and reporters frightened him. He believed that approaching the ransom would expose him, so he did not take the money. Instead, the exchange failed. From the family's perspective, this meant that the one promise they had been given had not been fulfilled. Peter had not been returned. From the investigators' perspective, the failed exchange created another problem. The person responsible had escaped without revealing himself. The case entered a period of uncertainty. The family remained without their child, and the authorities still had no confirmed identity for the kidnapper. The days that followed would bring new instructions and new attempts to establish contact. On July 10th, 6 days after Peter disappeared, the kidnapper called the Weinberger family twice. He provided additional instructions concerning the ransom. Again, the authorities followed the directions. Again, the exchange failed. A blue cloth bag was discovered near the roadside, containing another written message that provided instructions about where Peter would supposedly be found if everything went according to plan. Once again, the family was given a promise of their child's return, but the promise remained uncertain. The second message was nevertheless extremely important to the investigation because experts could compare its handwriting with the original ransom note. The writing was determined to have come from the same person. That connection gave investigators something they had not possessed before. Two separate pieces of writing that could be attributed to the same unknown individual. The case was still without a face, but it now had a distinctive signature in the literal sense of the word. For Peter's parents, however, evidence was not enough. What they needed was their son. Every message and every failed exchange represented another moment in which Peter remained missing. The investigation was moving forward, but the clock was moving with it. And as the days passed, the case was approaching a crucial point. Federal investigators would soon become involved, and the scale of the search would expand dramatically. The Weinberger family's tragedy was about to become one of the largest handwriting investigations the FBI had undertaken. But before the name Angelo Lamarca appeared in the case, there was still an enormous distance between two handwritten notes and the identity of the person who had written them. The first ransom exchange was supposed to be the moment when the disappearance of Peter Weinberger moved toward a resolution. Instead, it became another failure, another unanswered question, and another indication that the person responsible was not as confident or as organized as the ransom note had suggested. By the time the authorities prepared for the exchange, the Weinberger family had already endured the shock of discovering that their 1-month-old son had vanished. They had read the demand for $2,000. They had been warned not to involve the police. They had watched the story begin to attract public attention. And now, everything depended on what would happen at a specific location near Albemarle Road and Park Avenue. The instructions from the kidnapper were precise. The money was to be prepared in small denominations and placed inside a brown envelope. The location had been selected by the person demanding the ransom, who apparently believed that he could approach the money without being identified and then disappear. For Morris and Betty Weinberger, the instructions offered something that had been missing since July 4th, a possibility that Peter might actually come home, but the authorities could not simply hand over the money and hope that the kidnapper would keep his promise. The exchange represented an opportunity to identify the person responsible and, most importantly, to recover the child. A package representing the ransom was prepared and placed at the designated location. The situation was tense because there was very little margin for error. The person responsible had already demonstrated that he was willing to threaten the life of an infant. If the kidnapper realized that police were present, he could flee. If the authorities moved too quickly, they could frighten him. If they waited too long, Peter could remain in danger. The plan, therefore, depended upon patience and observation. But the person they were waiting for never came forward. The money remained uncollected. The exchange had failed. At first, there was no way for investigators to know exactly why. They knew only that the kidnapper had not appeared. The failure meant that Peter was still missing, and the investigation remained without a suspect. Later, after Angelo Lamarca had been identified and arrested, investigators would hear his explanation. According to his account, He had driven toward the area of the planned exchange while Peter was still with him. LaMarca had apparently intended to collect the ransom, but what he saw when he approached the area frightened him. There were too many police officers and reporters. Instead of moving toward the money, he became afraid that he would be recognized or captured. He abandoned the attempt and left the area. This detail would become significant because it revealed something about the person behind the kidnapping. The ransom note had presented an individual who appeared to be in control, issuing instructions and making threats. But in reality, according to LaMarca's later account, he was deeply afraid of being discovered. The presence of law enforcement and reporters was enough to make him abandon the exchange. That decision prolonged the ordeal for the Weinberger family and gave investigators no immediate opportunity to identify him. For Morris and Betty, the failure must have been devastating. They had followed the instructions as far as circumstances allowed, yet their child was still gone. The ransom demand had promised a possible reunion, but the promise had not materialized. The family remained trapped in the same terrible uncertainty. They knew someone had Peter, but they did not know where he was or what the kidnapper intended to do next. The investigators faced a similar problem. They had a missing infant, a ransom demand, and a failed exchange. But they did not have a face, a name, or a vehicle. There was no clear eyewitness who could identify the kidnapper. There was no known license plate that could lead investigators to a particular vehicle. There was no obvious explanation for why Peter had been selected. The absence of conventional evidence made the ransom note increasingly important. The handwriting was one of the few physical traces directly connected to the person responsible. Yet a handwriting sample by itself did not immediately provide a name. It was simply a characteristic of an unknown person. The investigators therefore had to wait for the kidnapper to make another move. The case did not end with a failed exchange. Instead, the following days created a strange combination of silence and renewed communication. The person who had taken Peter had failed to collect the ransom, but he had not completely abandoned his demand for money. 6 days after the kidnapping, on July 10th, the kidnapper contacted the Weinberger family again. He called twice and provided new instructions concerning the ransom. These calls demonstrated that he remained interested in obtaining the money. They also showed that he was still willing to communicate with the family despite the failed first attempt. For investigators, every communication represented both an opportunity and a danger. A new message might reveal something about the kidnapper. It might contain a physical clue. It might provide another chance to arrange an exchange. But it also meant that Peter's safety remained dependent upon the kidnapper's decisions. The authorities followed the new instructions. Once again, they waited for the person responsible to appear. Once again, he did not. The second exchange failed in much the same way as the first, yet something was left behind. Near the roadside, authorities discovered a blue cloth bag. Inside the bag was another handwritten message containing instructions concerning where Peter would supposedly be found if everything went according to plan. The message did not bring Peter home, but it gave investigators another piece of evidence. The handwriting could now be compared with the original ransom note. Experts determined that the two pieces of writing had been produced by the same person. That conclusion was important because it transformed the handwriting from an isolated clue into a consistent investigative signature. Two separate communications, created at different points in the kidnapping, could be connected to the same unknown writer. The investigators still did not know his identity, but they now had stronger grounds for believing that the same individual was behind the communications. The second failed exchange also reinforced the sense that the kidnapping was not unfolding according to a stable plan. The kidnapper had made demands, provided instructions, and promised a return, but the promised resolution never occurred. Each failed attempt increased the amount of time Peter remained separated from his family. Each new message created another opportunity for investigators, but also another period of uncertainty for the Weinbergers. The investigation was therefore developing along two parallel paths. On one side was the immediate effort to recover Peter. On the other was the slower task of identifying the person responsible. The first required locating a child whose whereabouts were unknown. The second required turning limited evidence into an identity. At this point, the case still lacked the scale of the investigation that would soon follow. The FBI had not yet formally entered the case under the legal framework of the time. That would happen on July 11th, 1 week after Peter's disappearance. Until then, the investigation remained heavily dependent on local authorities and the clues created by the kidnapper himself. But once the FBI became involved, the handwriting evidence would receive extraordinary attention. The failed ransom exchanges had left investigators with something unusual. The kidnapper had repeatedly communicated in writing, and those communications appeared to have been produced by the same hand. The question was no longer simply where the money should be placed or where the next exchange might occur. The question had become much larger. If investigators could determine who had written those messages, they might finally discover who had taken Peter. And if they could identify that person, perhaps they could learn where the child had been taken. But every hour mattered. Peter was still missing. His parents were still waiting. The kidnapper was still free. And the first two opportunities to exchange money for the child's safe return had already disappeared. The investigation was approaching the point where traditional methods would no longer be enough. What the authorities needed was a way to search for a person they could not see, could not name, and could not yet locate. They had only the words he had left behind. So, those words would become the center of one of the largest handwriting searches in the history of American criminal investigation. By July 10, 1956, 6 days had passed since Peter Weinberger disappeared. 6 days had passed since Betty Weinberger returned to the baby carriage and discovered that the child she had left there was no longer inside it. 6 days had passed since the first ransom note had transformed an ordinary family tragedy into a kidnapping investigation. And 6 days had passed without Peter being returned. The family was still waiting for information, while investigators were still trying to understand the person who had taken him. The first ransom exchange had already failed. The money had been prepared and placed according to the kidnapper's instructions, but he had not appeared. Later, Angelo Lamarca would explain that he had approached the area but became frightened when he saw police and reporters. At the time, however, investigators did not know the identity of the person who had been watching the failed exchange. They could only conclude that the kidnapper remained free and that Peter was still somewhere beyond their reach. Then, on July 10th, the silence was broken. The kidnapper called the Weinberger family twice. He gave them new instructions concerning the ransom. The calls were important because they established that the person responsible was still communicating and still apparently wanted the money. They also created another opportunity for investigators. Every new instruction might reveal something. Every meeting point might bring the authorities closer to the person responsible. But the situation remained extremely dangerous. Peter was an infant, and the ransom instructions were accompanied by the continuing threat that the child could be killed if the family or authorities made the wrong move. The investigators, therefore, had to work within the narrow space created by the kidnapper's demands. They could not simply force the situation without knowing where Peter was or how the kidnapper might react. The new instructions were followed, and authorities prepared for another attempted exchange. Once again, the hope was that the person responsible would come forward. Once again, that hope failed. The kidnapper did not appear. But unlike the first failed exchange, this attempt left behind another clue. Near the roadside, investigators found a blue cloth bag. Inside the bag was a handwritten message containing instructions about where Peter would supposedly be found if everything went according to plan. The message did not answer the question that mattered most to the Weinbergers: where was their son? But it provided something investigators desperately needed: another sample of the kidnapper's handwriting. The existence of two messages allowed experts to make a comparison. The original ransom note and the newer message were examined, and the handwriting was determined to have come from the same person. That finding did not immediately reveal the writer's name, but it strengthened the investigation in an important way. The handwriting was no longer a single unexplained clue. It was a repeated characteristic associated with the same unknown individual. The person responsible had left behind a pattern. For investigators, that pattern would soon become more valuable than almost anything else they possessed. Yet there was still a legal obstacle. In 1956, the FBI did not automatically take over every kidnapping investigation at the moment a child disappeared. Under the legal framework described in the case, when there was no indication that the victim or suspect had crossed state lines, federal involvement could be delayed for 7 days. Peter had disappeared on July 4th. The 7th day would therefore become an important date in the investigation. Until July 11th, local authorities continued working with the evidence available to them. Then, on July 11th, the FBI officially entered the case. The arrival of the federal investigators changed the scale of the operation. A temporary command center was established in Mineola, Long Island, and the investigation began operating continuously, 24 hours a day. The circumstances demanded an enormous effort. An infant was missing. The kidnapper had made ransom demands and threatened the child's life. 2 failed exchanges had occurred, and despite the communications, no one knew who the perpetrator was. The FBI therefore faced an investigation with a remarkably small number of conventional leads. There was no clear photograph of the suspect. There was no reliable eyewitness who could identify him. There was no known license plate connecting a vehicle to the kidnapping. There was no obvious motive beyond the demand for money. What investigators did possess were the written communications. The ransom note and the later message had already been connected by handwriting. That meant the writing itself could potentially become the bridge between an unknown criminal and an identifiable person. The problem was scale. The investigators did not know whose handwriting they were looking for. There was no simple list of suspects whose writing could be compared. They had to search broadly. FBI laboratory specialists were brought into the investigation, and agents were instructed to pay attention to characteristics in handwriting that might distinguish one writer from another. The investigation began moving away from the immediate physical scene of the kidnapping and into records containing handwriting samples from people in the surrounding area. This was a very different kind of search. Instead of looking for a particular vehicle, a particular face, or a witness who had seen the crime, investigators were searching for a particular way of forming letters. Records became potential sources of evidence. Vehicle records, probation records, criminal records, and other official documents could contain handwriting samples. Each sample represented a possible comparison. Most would have nothing to do with the kidnapping, but somewhere within the enormous number of records available to investigators was the handwriting of the person who had written the ransom messages. The scale of the task would eventually become extraordinary. Nearly 2 million handwriting samples would be examined. But at this stage, the investigators were only beginning that process. They were taking the clue they had and asking whether it could lead to an identity. The handwriting evidence also carried a deeper significance. The kidnapper had tried to control the investigation through his instructions. He had chosen where the money should be placed. He had decided when to call. He had abandoned the first exchange when he saw police and reporters. He had given new instructions after the first attempt failed. Yet in leaving written messages, he had also given investigators something he could not take back. The notes contained a trace of the person who had created them. Every letter, every characteristic of the writing, could potentially be compared against a record somewhere. The kidnapper had attempted to communicate on his own terms, but the act of communication itself had created evidence. For the Weinberger family, none of this changed the immediate reality. Peter was still missing. The investigation might have been expanding, but the family had no certainty about their son's condition or location. The passage of time was becoming increasingly important. The longer Peter remained away from home, the greater the fear surrounding his disappearance. The investigators had to work without knowing whether their next clue would lead to Peter or simply to another dead end. The case had therefore reached a critical stage. The first ransom exchange had failed. The second had failed. The kidnapper remained unidentified. But now the FBI had the case, a temporary command center, forensic specialists, and 2 pieces of handwriting that appeared to belong to the same person. The question became brutally simple. How do you find one unknown writer among the records of an entire region? The answer would require an investigation on an extraordinary scale. Investigators would begin examining handwriting samples by the hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands. They would search records for similarities to the writing on the ransom notes. Somewhere within that vast collection would be a sample that would change the direction of the case. The name attached to it would be Angelo John Lamarca. But at the beginning of the search, he was simply one person among an enormous population. The investigators did not yet know his name. They did not know where he lived. They did not know his financial circumstances or his connection to the kidnapping. They only knew that an unknown person had written the ransom messages and that the writing might be the only path to identifying him. As July moved forward, the FBI's search would grow larger and more systematic. What began with 1 missing baby and 2 handwritten notes was becoming a forensic investigation measured not in dozens of suspects, but in nearly 2 million handwriting samples. The challenge was no longer simply finding Peter. It was finding the person who had taken him before the trail disappeared completely. By the time the FBI took an active role in the investigation, the case had reached a point where the most obvious avenues had already produced little. Peter Weinberger was still missing. The ransom exchanges had failed. The person responsible had managed to communicate with the family without revealing his identity. There was no clear photograph, no reliable eyewitness, no known license plate, and no obvious reason why Peter had been selected. Yet the kidnapper had made one mistake that would become central to the investigation. He had written his demands down. The ransom note and the later message were not simply instructions. They were physical evidence created by the person investigators were trying to find. The handwriting had already been identified as belonging to the same individual. Now the FBI had to answer the next question. Whose handwriting was it? The problem was enormous. Investigators did not have a short list of suspects whose writing could be compared. They needed to search through existing records and look for a person whose handwriting displayed characteristics consistent with the ransom communications. FBI laboratory specialists were brought into the investigation, and agents were instructed to focus on the characteristics of handwriting that could distinguish one writer from another. The task required patience and an extraordinary amount of comparison. Records containing handwriting samples became potential sources of evidence. Vehicle records could contain writing. Probation records could contain writing. Criminal and other official records could contain writing. Each sample had to be considered against the handwriting from the ransom messages. Most of those samples would have nothing to do with Peter's disappearance. But the investigators did not know which one would matter. The scale of the search eventually reached a number that is difficult to comprehend even today. 974, 544 handwriting samples were examined. Nearly 2 million samples. The number illustrates just how uncertain the investigation was at the beginning of the handwriting search. There was no obvious suspect waiting to be identified. Instead, investigators had to work backward from the writing itself. They had to begin with an unknown hand and search through an enormous collection of known hands. This was not a search based on a face. It was not a search based on a voice. It was not even a search based on a vehicle. It was a search based on the way a person wrote. Every sample represented another possibility to be eliminated or considered. The investigators were effectively trying to find one person hidden inside an enormous population of records. For the Weinberger family, the scale of the operation was almost beside the point. They did not need nearly 2 million comparisons. They needed one name, one location, one answer that could lead to Peter. But the investigation could not skip the process. The ransom notes had given investigators a clue. But the clue had to be connected to an actual person. The work was therefore systematic. FBI specialists examined the writing while investigators searched records that might contain comparable samples. The process gradually reduced an otherwise overwhelming field of possibilities. Somewhere in the records was a handwriting sample that would stand out. That breakthrough came through a sample located at the U.S. Probation Office in Brooklyn. A worker there noticed handwriting that showed significant similarities to the writing found on the ransom communications. The sample was not simply an anonymous piece of paper. It was connected to a name. That name was Angelo John LaMarca. Until that moment, LaMarca had not been the central figure in the investigation. He was not known to the public as the man responsible for Peter's disappearance. He was simply a person whose handwriting had come under examination because it appeared to correspond with the evidence investigators had collected. But the discovery changed the direction of the case. The unknown writer now had an identity. LaMarca was approximately 31 years old and lived in Plainview, Long Island. He was married and had 2 children. He worked in occupations connected with taxi coordination and truck driving. On the surface, there was nothing about this basic profile that automatically explained why he would be connected to the kidnapping of a 1-month-old child. The investigators now had to determine whether the handwriting connection was more than a similarity. They needed to understand who LaMarca was, what circumstances might have surrounded him at the time of the kidnapping, and whether his life contained any possible motive. The investigation began to reveal financial pressure. LaMarca had debts and unpaid bills, and he was being pressured by a loan shark. His financial circumstances provided a possible explanation for why someone might become desperate for money. His background also included involvement in alcohol smuggling and a previous arrest by the Treasury Department. None of these facts alone established that he had kidnapped Peter, but together with the handwriting evidence, they created a reason for investigators to look more closely at him. There was another question that mattered even more. How would LaMarca have come into contact with Peter? According to LaMarca's later account, the answer was not a long period of surveillance or an elaborate plan. He said that on July 4th he had been driving around Westbury while desperately looking for a way to obtain money. At some point, he passed the Weinberger residence. He saw Betty place her infant son in the baby carriage. And then, according to his later statement, he decided to take the child. That account was deeply disturbing because it suggested that Peter had not been selected because of his family's identity or wealth. He had apparently become the target because LaMarca happened to see him at a vulnerable moment. The kidnapping, in this version of events, was not the result of a carefully researched plan aimed specifically at the Weinberger family. It was an opportunity that presented itself. Peter was simply there. The idea of a child being selected in this way made the case even more frightening. If the kidnapping had been based on a long-standing relationship, investigators could search for someone connected to the family. If it had been based on the family's wealth, they could examine people who knew about their finances. But if Peter had been chosen because someone happened to see him outside the home, then the crime had emerged from an unpredictable encounter. The handwriting investigation had therefore done something that conventional investigative methods had not yet achieved. It had connected a physical clue to a specific individual. The letters on the ransom note had become a pathway to LaMarca. But the discovery did not yet answer the most important question. Where was Peter? Identifying the man who may have written the ransom notes was only the beginning. Investigators still had to determine whether LaMarca was actually the kidnapper, and if he was, what had happened to the child. The investigation now moved from a massive search for an unknown writer toward a direct examination of one man. The handwriting evidence had narrowed the field from nearly 2 million samples to a single name. But a name on a record was not the same as a confession, and a handwriting similarity was not the same as locating a missing infant. The investigators still had to confront LaMarca himself. They would have to go to his home, question him, and determine whether the man whose handwriting appeared to match the ransom communications was the person responsible for the disappearance of Peter Weinberger. The answer would come on August 23, 1956. On that day, FBI agents and Nassau County Police would arrive at LaMarca's home. At first, he would deny any involvement, but the investigators were no longer searching blindly. They had spent weeks tracing the handwriting back through an enormous body of records, and the trail had led them directly to him. The next stage of the case would depend on what happened when the evidence was placed in front of Angelo LaMarca. For the first time since Peter disappeared, investigators were no longer asking who the kidnapper might be. They had a specific man in front of them. The question now was whether he would continue to deny everything or whether the evidence would force him to reveal what had happened to the missing child. On August 23, 1956, the investigation into the disappearance of Peter Weinberger reached its most important turning point. For weeks, investigators had been searching for the person behind the ransom messages. The search had begun with almost nothing: a missing infant, a handwritten note, and a second message connected to the first by handwriting. From there, the FBI had examined an extraordinary number of records, eventually comparing nearly 2 million handwriting samples. The process had led investigators to one name: Angelo John LaMarca. Now the man whose handwriting appeared to correspond with the ransom communications was no longer an unknown figure hidden somewhere among millions of records. FBI agents and Nassau County Police went to LaMarca's home. He was approximately 31 years old, married, the father of 2 children, and living in Plainview, Long Island. On the surface, his life did not immediately explain how he could be connected to the disappearance of a 1-month-old baby. But investigators had already learned that he was under financial pressure. He had debts and unpaid bills, and he was being pressured by a loan shark. His background also included involvement in alcohol smuggling and a previous arrest by the Treasury Department. These circumstances provided context, but they did not by themselves prove that he had kidnapped Peter. The critical evidence remained the handwriting and whatever LaMarca might say when confronted by investigators. Initially, LaMarca denied involvement. The denial was important because the investigation had reached the point at which suspicion had to be tested directly. The authorities had traced the handwriting to him, but they still needed to establish what connection he had to the kidnapping. According to the supplied account, investigators confronted him with the handwriting evidence. As the evidence was presented, his position began to change. Eventually, LaMarca admitted that he was responsible for taking Peter. The confession transformed the investigation. For the first time, investigators had the account of the person they believe had committed the kidnapping. But the confession did not immediately solve the mystery of Peter's whereabouts. Instead, it created an even more disturbing question. What had happened to the child after LaMarca abandoned his attempt to collect the ransom? LaMarca described what he had done after the failed exchange. According to his account, he had driven away from the area where the ransom was supposed to be collected. He said that he left Peter in an area containing brush and vegetation near a highway exit. Most disturbing of all, he claimed that the baby was still alive when he left him there. That statement changed the nature of the search. Investigators were no longer simply looking for a missing child who might still be in the kidnapper's possession. They now had a specific location to search, but they also had to confront the possibility that Peter had been abandoned alone. The information provided by LaMarca offered a direction, but it did not provide certainty. His description had to be tested against the physical evidence. The next day, August 24th, LaMarca led investigators to the area where he said he had left Peter. FBI agents and Nassau County Police began searching the location. The scene represented the final stage of a search that had begun 3 weeks earlier at the Weinberger home. On July 4th, investigators had been faced with an empty baby carriage and a ransom note. Now, on August 24th, they were searching through an area described by the man who had confessed to taking the child. Every part of the search carried the weight of the question the family had been asking since the beginning: where was Peter? The investigators searched the area carefully. Then an agent noticed a small object lying on the ground. It was a diaper pin, The discovery was significant because it indicated that the search was focused on the correct area. The investigators continued, and eventually they found the body of Peter Weinberger. The recovery ended the uncertainty about Peter's whereabouts, but it brought the case to its most painful conclusion. The child whom investigators and his parents had hoped to recover alive had died. The search that had begun with the belief that a ransom payment might bring him home had ended with the discovery of his remains. The condition of Peter's body made it difficult to establish every detail of his final hours. Information presented during the legal proceedings referred to several possible contributing factors, including suffocation, starvation, and exposure, with suffocation identified as the principal cause according to the forensic testimony described in the case materials. The precise sequence of events remained difficult to reconstruct. One important distinction had to be made. Lamarca's statement that he left Peter alive did not mean that the child died immediately after being abandoned. The forensic information indicated that Peter may have survived for some period after Lamarca left him. That possibility made the circumstances especially painful. A baby who was only about 1 month old had been left alone, separated from the parents who had been searching for him. The investigation could now establish what had happened in broad terms, but it could not undo the suffering caused by the kidnapping. The discovery also forced investigators to examine Lamarca's statements carefully. His confession had provided important information, but his account was not completely consistent. After admitting responsibility, he offered different statements concerning possible accomplices. At one point, he mentioned a man named Joe Parisi. Parisi was investigated and arrested in connection with the accusation, but Lamarca later withdrew the claim and admitted that he had given Parisi's name in order to cause trouble for him. This introduced another layer of uncertainty into an already complicated case. If Lamarca was willing to provide a false name after confessing, investigators had to distinguish carefully between information that could be supported by evidence and statements that might serve another purpose. He later referred to another person known as Shorty. Investigators were unable to identify that person based on Lamarca's description. These changing statements did not erase the evidence that had already connected Lamarca to the ransom communications. The handwriting remained a central physical link between the man in custody and the messages sent during the kidnapping. His confession provided another important connection, and the recovery of Peter's body provided the physical conclusion to the search. The sequence was now becoming clearer. Peter had been taken from outside his family's home on July 4th. A ransom demand had followed. The first attempted exchange had failed. A second set of instructions had also failed to produce a successful ransom collection. The handwriting from the communications had eventually led investigators through an enormous search to Lamarca. On August 23rd, he was arrested and ultimately confessed. On August 24th, he led authorities to the location where Peter was found. But the case did not end with the discovery of Peter's body. Investigators still had to establish responsibility in court. Lamarca would be formally charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. His defense would later challenge the case through a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution would have to present the evidence that connected him to the kidnapping, while the defense would attempt to explain his mental state and the circumstances surrounding his actions. For the Weinberger family, however, the legal process could not change the central fact. Their son was dead. The hope that had sustained the family through weeks of ransom instructions, failed exchanges, an investigation had ended. The discovery of Peter brought an answer to the question of where he was, but it was an answer no parent could have wanted. The case also revealed the devastating consequences of an apparently opportunistic kidnapping. According to Lamarca's later account, Peter had not been selected after an elaborate investigation into the Weinberger family. Lamarca had reportedly been driving through Westbury while desperate for money when he happened to see Betty place the baby in the carriage. The child had simply been there. That account made the crime especially disturbing because it suggested that Peter's disappearance may have depended on a moment of chance rather than a long-standing plan. The investigation had taken investigators from a handwritten note to nearly 2 million samples. From those samples to La Marca, and from La Marca to the place where Peter was found. But the final discovery could not restore the child to his family. The next stage would therefore move away from the search itself and into the courtroom. There, the evidence would be tested, Lamarca's changing statements would be examined, and the question of his responsibility would be placed before a jury. The investigation had found its suspect and recovered Peter, but the legal process was only beginning. The man who had once been an unknown writer of ransom notes was now facing the possibility of the death penalty. The story of Peter Weinberger had entered its final and most consequential chapter, the trial of Angelo La Marca. By the time Angelo La Marca entered the courtroom, the central facts of the case were no longer hidden. Peter Weinberger had been taken from outside his family's home on July 4, 1956. A ransom demand for $2,000 had followed. 2 attempted exchanges had failed. The handwriting on the ransom communications had eventually led investigators through nearly 2 million samples to La Marca. On August 23rd, he had been arrested and, after initially denying involvement, ultimately confessed to abducting Peter. The following day, he led investigators to the area where the child was found. The investigation had answered the question of who was responsible, but the courtroom now had to answer a different question. What should the law do with the man responsible for Peter's death? On August 29, 1956, La Marca was formally charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. The charges reflected the seriousness of what had happened to Peter, but they also placed La Marca in a position where every part of the investigation would be examined through the legal process. The ransom notes, the handwriting evidence, his statements, the circumstances of the kidnapping, and the discovery of Peter's body would all form part of the case surrounding him. Yet the defense would not simply accept the prosecution's characterization of La Marca's actions. On September 5th, he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. That decision introduced another question into the proceedings. The issue was no longer only whether La Marca had participated in the kidnapping. His mental condition and ability to understand or control his actions would also become relevant too. The defense. The circumstances surrounding La Marca's life provided the basis for that argument. He had been under serious financial pressure. He had debts and unpaid bills, and he was being pressured by a loan shark. His background also included involvement in alcohol smuggling and a previous arrest by the Treasury Department. The defense sought to place his actions within the context of these pressures and his mental state. The argument did not erase the events of July 4th, but it attempted to explain the condition of the man who had committed them. The trial began on November 5th, 1956, in Nassau County. By then, the case had already attracted enormous public and media attention. Peter's disappearance had shocked the country because he was only about 1 month old and came from an ordinary middle-class family. The discovery of his body had turned the case from a desperate search into a murder investigation. Now the courtroom became the place where the evidence would be assembled into a legal narrative. At the center of that narrative was the handwriting investigation. The ransom communications had provided the investigators with one of the few direct physical traces of the kidnapper. The first note demanded $2,000 and contained instructions for the ransom. A later message, found in a blue cloth bag after another failed exchange, had been written by the same person. Those 2 pieces of writing had allowed investigators to establish that the communications were connected. But the crucial breakthrough came when investigators compared the writing with samples from existing records. Nearly 2 million samples were examined. Eventually, a handwriting sample at the U.S. Probation Office in Brooklyn drew attention because of its similarities to the ransom writings. The name connected to that sample was Angelo John La Marca. The significance of this evidence was difficult to overstate. At the beginning of the investigation, the person responsible had no known identity. There was no reliable eyewitness, no clear photograph, and no known license plate. The handwriting provided the bridge from an anonymous kidnapper to a specific man. Once LaMarca was identified, investigators could examine his background and confront him directly. When they went to his home on August 23rd, he initially denied involvement. But when confronted with the handwriting evidence, he eventually changed his position and confessed. His confession provided another major piece of evidence connecting him to the kidnapping. He described how he had abandoned his attempt to collect the ransom and left Peter in an area near a highway exit. He said that the child was still alive when he left him. The authorities subsequently recovered Peter from that area. Yet LaMarca's statements after his confession also created complications. He offered different accounts involving possible accomplices. At one point, he mentioned Joe Parisi. That accusation was serious enough for Parisi to be investigated and arrested. But LaMarca later withdrew the claim and admitted that he had given Parisi's name in order to cause trouble for him. The episode raised obvious questions about the reliability of LaMarca's statements. If he was willing to implicate another person falsely, investigators and prosecutors had to distinguish between his admissions that were supported by evidence and claims that could not be verified. LaMarca later referred to another individual known as Shorty, but investigators could not identify that person from the description he provided. These claims did not change the central evidence against LaMarca, but they complicated the picture surrounding his confession. The prosecution could point to the physical evidence and the sequence of events that connected LaMarca to the crime. The handwriting linked him to the ransom communications. His confession linked him directly to the kidnapping. His account of abandoning Peter led investigators to the area where the child's body was recovered. The defense, meanwhile, had the insanity plea and the circumstances surrounding LaMarca's financial and personal pressures. The courtroom, therefore, became a place where two different interpretations of LaMarca's actions were placed against each other. One focused on responsibility and the evidence connecting him to the kidnapping. The other sought to challenge the extent to which his mental condition and circumstances affected his judgment. But regardless of how LaMarca's state of mind was interpreted, the consequences of his actions remained the same. Peter Weinberger was dead. He had been approximately 1 month old when he was taken. His parents had spent weeks waiting for him to be returned, following ransom instructions and hoping that the next communication might finally lead to their son's safe recovery. Instead, the investigation had ended with the discovery of his body. The jury ultimately found LaMarca guilty. The verdict brought the criminal investigation to its legal conclusion. He was sentenced to death, and on December 14, 1956, the death sentence was formally imposed. For the Weinberger family, the verdict could not undo the loss. It could not restore the ordinary summer day that had existed before Peter disappeared. It could not return their son to the carriage outside their home. It could only establish legal responsibility for what had happened. The case also demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between what investigators knew and what they could prove. LaMarca had offered conflicting statements about other people, but the central evidence against him did not depend entirely on those claims. The handwriting investigation had independently led authorities to his name. His confession followed. His directions led authorities to Peter. Those elements formed a chain connecting the kidnapping to LaMarca, even as parts of his later statements remained uncertain. The verdict, therefore, represented more than a punishment for one individual. It was the culmination of an investigation that had begun with almost no conventional evidence and had eventually identified a suspect through the unusual route of handwriting analysis. The story might have ended with the death sentence, but LaMarca was not finished with the courts. He continued to challenge the conviction. His case moved through the New York judicial system and eventually involved further review connected with the United States Supreme Court. The appeals represented his final opportunities to challenge the legal consequences of his actions. But the conviction and sentence remained in place. The courtroom had produced its judgment, yet the case was still not completely over. The final chapter would come not in Nassau County, but but at Sing Sing prison. On August 7, 1958, Angelo John Lamarca was executed. With his death, the legal proceedings surrounding the kidnapping of Peter Weinberger finally ended. But the significance of the case extended beyond the fate of the man who had committed the crime. The investigation had exposed weaknesses in the way kidnapping cases were handled under the law at the time. It had also demonstrated the potential of forensic handwriting analysis on an extraordinary scale. Most importantly, however, the case left behind the memory of a 1-month-old child whose life ended before it had truly begun. Lamarca's conviction and execution closed the legal story, but they could never close the personal tragedy experienced by Peter's parents. Their son had been taken from an ordinary moment outside their home, and no verdict could return that moment to them. The final consequences of the case would therefore reach beyond the courtroom. The tragedy would contribute to changes in the way federal authorities could respond to kidnappings, while the investigation itself would become an enduring example of how a seemingly small piece of evidence could lead investigators through an enormous search. But before those changes could be fully understood, there was still one final question. What would America learn from the disappearance and death of Peter Weinberger? The legal story of Angelo Lamarca did not end when a jury found him guilty. After the conviction and death sentence, Lamarca continued to challenge the judgment through the courts. The case moved through the New York judicial system and eventually involved further review connected with the United States Supreme Court. But the conviction remained in place. The evidence that had brought the investigation to Lamarca had also created a strong foundation for the prosecution. The ransom communications, the handwriting that connected those communications to him, his eventual confession, and the information he provided about where Peter had been left. The appeals, therefore, did not erase the judgment that had already been reached. The legal process continued, but the outcome remained unchanged. On August 7, 1958, Angelo John Lamarca was executed at Sing Sing prison. With his execution, the formal legal story of the man responsible for Peter Weinberger's kidnapping came to an end. But the case itself did not disappear. Its significance reached far beyond the fate of one defendant. The disappearance of Peter had exposed serious questions about how quickly federal authorities could respond to a kidnapping. In 1956, the FBI's ability to become formally involved in certain kidnapping cases could be delayed by a 7-day requirement when there was no indication that the victim or suspect had crossed state lines. Peter disappeared on July 4th. The FBI officially entered the investigation on July 11th. That delay became one of the important issues surrounding the case. The Weinberger kidnapping demonstrated how much could happen during those 7 days. A child could disappear, ransom instructions could be issued, attempted exchanges could fail, and the person responsible could continue moving without being identified. The tragedy helped generate pressure for a change in the law. Following the case, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a change reducing the waiting period from 7 days to 24 hours. The significance of that change was straightforward. In a kidnapping investigation, time can be critical. Waiting for a predetermined period before federal authorities can become involved may allow a suspect to move, a victim to be harmed, or evidence to disappear. The Weinberger case became part of the historical movement toward faster federal involvement in kidnapping investigations. The case also left an important investigative legacy through its use of handwriting analysis. At the beginning of the investigation, handwriting appeared to be a relatively narrow clue. There were only 2 principal written communications connected to the kidnapping. Neither immediately revealed the identity of the person who had written them. Yet the FBI transformed that clue into a massive search. Investigators examined 1,974,544 handwriting samples. Nearly 2 million samples were considered. The scale of that operation demonstrated both the limitations and the possibilities of forensic investigation in the 1950s. Without a face, reliable eyewitness, known vehicle, or obvious suspect, investigators had to find another path. the writing became that path. A sample located at the U.S. Probation Office in Brooklyn showed significant similarities to the ransom communications. The name connected to the sample was Angelo John LaMarca. The discovery did not, by itself, tell investigators everything about the kidnapping, but it gave them a direction. It transformed an unknown writer into a specific person whose background and activities could be examined. The investigation that followed eventually resulted in LaMarca's arrest and confession. In that sense, the handwriting was not merely a supporting detail. It was one of the critical bridges between the ransom note and the man who had written it. Yet the forensic success should not obscure the human tragedy at the center of the case. Peter Weinberger was not an abstract piece of evidence. He was a 1-month-old child who had been taken from his family. His parents, Morris and Betty Weinberger, had begun the case with the most basic hope any parent could have, that their son would be returned alive. The ransom instructions gave them moments of hope, but the failed exchanges repeatedly destroyed those expectations. The first exchange did not produce Peter. The second did not produce Peter either. The messages continued, but the promised return never came. Eventually, the investigation led authorities to LaMarca. His confession led them to the area where Peter had been abandoned. A diaper pin was found, and then Peter's body was recovered. The search had ended, but the family's suffering had not. The circumstances surrounding Peter's death remained difficult to reconstruct completely because of the condition of his body. The information presented during the proceedings referred to suffocation, starvation, and exposure, with suffocation described as the principal cause according to the forensic testimony included in the case account. LaMarca said that Peter was alive when he left him. That statement did not establish that the child died immediately. The forensic evidence indicated that Peter may have survived for some period after being abandoned. This distinction matters because it emphasizes the uncertainty surrounding Peter's final moments. Investigators could establish the broad sequence of events, but they could not recover every detail of what the infant experienced after he was left alone. For the family, that uncertainty would have been another painful part of the loss. The case also leaves a disturbing question about chance. According to LaMarca's later account, Peter was not the result of a long-term selection process. LaMarca had reportedly been driving around Westbury while desperate for money. He passed the Weinberger residence and saw Betty place her infant son in the baby carriage. From that moment, he decided to take the child. If that account is accurate, Peter was not targeted because his family had been studied or because the kidnapper had some established connection to them. He was simply seen. That possibility makes the crime particularly unsettling because it removes the comfort of believing that there was something distinctive about the Weinberger family that made them vulnerable. The crime could happen because an opportunity appeared. The case therefore became a reminder of how quickly an ordinary moment could become irreversible. Betty had placed her infant in the carriage. She went inside briefly. When she returned, the carriage remained, but Peter was gone. Everything that followed, the ransom notes, the failed exchanges, the FBI investigation, the massive handwriting search, the arrest, the confession, the recovery of Peter, the trial, and the execution grew from those few moments. The investigation was extraordinary in scale, but its origin was painfully small. One child missing from one carriage. The legacy of the case also lies in the way investigators adapted when conventional evidence was unavailable. They did not have the luxury of a clear suspect. They did not have a reliable eyewitness. They did not have a license plate or a clear photograph. Instead, they followed the evidence they did have. The ransom notes contained handwriting. The handwriting could be compared. The comparisons could be expanded. Records could be searched. Eventually, one sample led to one name. That name led to one man. And that man led investigators to the place where Peter was found. The chain was long, but each link mattered. At the same time, the legal consequences demonstrated that the case was not simply about solving one kidnapping. The delay in federal involvement became part of a larger discussion about how kidnapping cases should be handled. The reduction of the waiting period from 7 days to 24 hours reflected a basic lesson. When a child is taken, investigators cannot assume that time is available. The first hours may be critical, and the law must allow authorities to respond accordingly. More than 6 decades later, the name Peter Weinberger remains associated with a case that combined personal tragedy, investigative persistence, forensic handwriting analysis, and legal change. But the most important way to remember the case is not through the notoriety of Angelo Lamarca. It is through the life that was taken before it had barely begun. Peter was born on June 2, 1956. He disappeared on July 4th. He was only about 1 month old. His parents had expected the ordinary future that parents imagine for a newborn, watching him grow, hearing him speak, seeing him develop, and building a life around his presence. Instead, their son became the center of a national kidnapping investigation. The law eventually punished the man responsible. The investigation eventually established what had happened. The legal system eventually closed the case. But none of those outcomes could restore Peter. That is the final truth of the Weinberger kidnapping. The investigation succeeded in identifying the perpetrator, but it did not achieve the outcome that mattered most. Peter was not brought home alive. The empty baby carriage remained the most powerful image of the entire case, not because it represented a mystery that could never be solved, but because it represented a life that had been suddenly removed from an ordinary family. The ransom note led investigators toward Lamarca. The handwriting search gave the case a name. The confession revealed the path to Peter. The courtroom produced a conviction. The execution ended the legal process. And the changes that followed altered the way kidnapping investigations could be handled in the future. But beneath all of those developments was a single, irreparable loss. A 1-month-old child disappeared from outside his home on a summer day in 1956. And the country watched as investigators tried to bring him back. They found the man responsible. They found Peter. They changed the law. But they could not change the ending. That is why the story of Peter Weinberger remains so haunting. It is not ultimately a story about the cleverness of a criminal or the spectacle of a famous investigation. It is the story of a child whose life was taken, a family whose world was shattered, and an investigation that continued until the last question had been answered. The carriage was still there. The money was prepared. The notes had been written. Nearly 2 million handwriting samples were examined. A name was found. A suspect was arrested. A body was recovered. A conviction was secured. And decades later, the central image remains unchanged. On July 4th, 1956, a mother returned to the place where she had left her baby and discovered that the carriage was still there. But Peter was not. The execution of Angelo John Lamarca on August 7th, 1958, brought the legal proceedings surrounding the kidnapping of Peter Weinberger to an end. But it did not bring the story itself to an end. The case had already become larger than the individuals involved. It had exposed weaknesses in the way kidnapping investigations could be handled under federal law, demonstrated the potential of handwriting examination on an extraordinary scale, and left behind a tragedy that could never be corrected by a conviction or a sentence. Peter's death remained the central fact. Everything else, the ransom, the investigation, the handwriting search, the trial, the appeals, and the execution, came after the loss of a child who had been only about 1 month old. Looking back at the case, the most striking feature is how ordinary its beginning was. Peter Weinberger had been born on June 2nd, 1956, to Morris and Betty Weinberger, a middle-class family in Westbury, Long Island. On July 4th, Betty placed her infant son in a baby carriage outside the family home and went inside for a few minutes. There was no elaborate scene, no known confrontation, and no warning that the moment would become the beginning of a national criminal investigation. When she returned, the carriage was still there, but Peter was gone. Beside it was a handwritten ransom note. The note demanded $2,000 and warned the family that Peter would be killed if they contacted the authorities or made a mistake. The threat was intended to isolate the family. Instead, the Weinbergers reported the kidnapping to police. From that point forward, the investigation became a race against time. The first ransom exchange was arranged for the area near Albemarle Road and Park Avenue. A package containing what was intended to be ransom money was prepared, but the kidnapper never collected it. Investigators later learned why. LaMarca had approached the area with Peter, but became frightened when he saw the police and reporters. He abandoned the attempt and left. 6 days after the kidnapping, on July 10th, he contacted the family twice and provided new instructions. Again, the promised exchange did not happen. A blue cloth bag was found near the roadside, containing another handwritten message. That second message became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation because experts determined that it had been written by the same person who had written the original ransom note. The significance of that discovery became even greater after the FBI officially entered the case on July 11th. At the time, federal involvement in certain kidnapping cases could be delayed for 7 days if there was no indication that the victim or suspect had crossed state lines. Peter's kidnapping, therefore, became an example of the limitations created by that legal framework. The FBI established a temporary command center in Mineola and began working around the clock. But the investigators faced an extraordinary lack of conventional evidence. They had no clear photograph of the kidnapper. They had no reliable eyewitness who could identify him. They had no known license plate. They did not know the motive beyond the ransom demand. And they did not know where Peter was. What they did have was handwriting. That seemingly small clue became the foundation of an enormous search. FBI laboratory specialists examined handwriting characteristics and investigators searched available records for comparable samples. The operation eventually involved 1,974,544 handwriting samples. Nearly 2 million examples had to be examined in an attempt to identify one unknown writer. Somewhere within those records was the handwriting of the person who had written the ransom communications. Eventually, a worker at the U.S. Probation Office in Brooklyn identified a sample showing significant similarities to the writing on the ransom notes. The name attached to that sample was Angelo John LaMarca. The investigation had moved from an unknown criminal to a specific individual. LaMarca was approximately 31 years old and lived in Plainview, Long Island. He was married and had 2 children. He worked in occupations involving taxi coordination and truck driving. Investigators also learned about his financial problems. He had debts and unpaid bills and was under pressure from a loan shark. His background included involvement in alcohol smuggling and a previous arrest by the Treasury Department. Those facts provided possible context for the ransom demand, but they were not what had initially led investigators to him. The handwriting had. That distinction is important because it shows how the investigation developed. The authorities did not begin with LaMarca and search for evidence against him. They began with the writing and worked backward toward his identity. On August 23rd, FBI agents and Nassau County Police went to LaMarca's home. He initially denied involvement, but after investigators confronted him with the handwriting evidence, his position changed. Eventually, he confessed to taking Peter. His confession provided investigators with information about what had happened after the failed ransom exchange. LaMarca said that he had driven away and abandoned Peter in an area with trees or brush near a highway exit. He said the child was still alive when he left him. The following day, August 24th, LaMarca led investigators to the location. During the search, an agent noticed a diaper pin on the ground. Investigators then found Peter's body. The discovery ended the physical search, but it did not resolve every detail of Peter's final hours. Because of the condition of the body, the precise circumstances of his death were difficult to establish. Information presented during the proceedings referred to suffocation, starvation, and exposure, with suffocation described as the principal cause according to the forensic testimony included in the case account. Lamarca's statement that he had left Peter alive also had to be distinguished from the question of exactly when the child died. The available forensic information indicated that Peter may have survived for some period after he was abandoned. The uncertainty surrounding those final moments was another painful element of the case. Lamarca's later statements also created additional complications. He attempted to implicate other people, including a man named Joe Parisi. Parisi was arrested during the investigation, but Lamarca later withdrew the accusation and admitted that he had given Parisi's name in order to cause trouble for him. Lamarca also referred to someone called Shorty, but investigators could not identify that individual based on the description he provided. These statements demonstrated that investigators could not simply accept every claim Lamarca made. His account had to be evaluated against independent evidence. The strongest elements remained the handwriting connection, his confession, and the information that led authorities to Peter. On August 29th, Lamarca was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. On September 5th, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense sought to place his conduct within the context of his mental condition and severe financial pressures. The trial began on November 5, 1956, in Nassau County. The jury ultimately found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. On December 14th, the death sentence was formally imposed. Lamarca continued to appeal, and his case moved through the New York courts and eventually involved further review connected with the United States Supreme Court. But the conviction remained in place. On August 7, 1958, he was executed at Sing Sing prison. His death ended the legal process, but the case had already begun to influence something beyond the punishment of one offender. The 7-day federal waiting period became a major issue. The Weinberger kidnapping demonstrated the consequences of having a period in which federal authorities could not formally enter certain cases. After the tragedy, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a change reducing the waiting period from 7 days to 24 hours. That change was an important consequence of the case because it reflected a fundamental lesson. Kidnapping investigations cannot always afford to wait. A missing child may be in immediate danger, and investigators may need federal resources much sooner than 7 days after the disappearance. The Weinberger case, therefore, became part of a broader transformation in the way the United States approached kidnapping. Its investigative legacy was equally significant. Nearly 2 million handwriting samples had been examined because investigators had no conventional identification of the perpetrator. The success of that search demonstrated how a document left behind by a criminal could become a route to identification. The ransom note had been intended to control the Weinberger family. Instead, the writing ultimately helped expose the person who had created it. That is one of the most important lessons of the case. Evidence does not always appear in the form investigators expect. Sometimes the smallest trace can become the most valuable one when it is examined carefully and compared against enough information. But the greatest lesson remains human rather than procedural. The Weinberger case was not simply a demonstration of forensic technique or a milestone in federal law. It was the story of a family that lost a child. Peter's parents did not receive the ending promised by the ransom instructions. They did not see their son return safely. The money did not bring him home. The investigation did. But it brought him home only in the form of his remains. The law eventually punished the person responsible, yet punishment could not reverse the loss. Peter had been born only weeks earlier, and his life was already over before it had truly begun. The case therefore leaves behind a difficult contrast. Investigators achieved something extraordinary. They identified a previously unknown offender through a massive handwriting search, obtained a confession, recovered Peter, secured a conviction, and contributed to a change in federal kidnapping law. Yet the central objective of every kidnapping investigation, to recover the victim alive, was not achieved. That distinction should remain at the center of the story. The success of the investigation cannot be measured only by the arrest of LaMarca or the eventual execution. It must also be measured against the tragedy that made the investigation necessary. Peter was missing, and the search continued until his whereabouts were finally established. The case changed investigative procedures and influenced federal law. But those changes came at a terrible price. The memory of Peter Weinberger therefore belongs not to the notoriety of his kidnapper, but to the lessons left behind by the child whose disappearance forced investigators and lawmakers to confront the consequences of delay. In the summer of 1956, an infant could disappear from outside his own home, and the law could require federal investigators to wait before becoming formally involved. By the end of the case, that reality had begun to change. The ransom notes had shown the power of forensic evidence. The handwriting search had shown what investigators could accomplish when conventional clues were absent. And the tragedy had shown why time mattered. Peter's story ended with his recovery, but his death became part of a larger historical lesson. When a child disappears, every hour can matter, every piece of evidence can matter, and waiting can carry consequences that cannot be undone. The story of Peter Weinberger began with an ordinary moment and ended by changing the way America thought about kidnapping. On July 4th, 1956, Peter was only about 1 month old. His mother, Betty Weinberger, placed him in a baby carriage outside the family home in Westbury, Long Island, and went inside for a few minutes. When she returned, the carriage was still there, but her son had disappeared. A handwritten note left nearby demanded $2,000 and threatened Peter's life if the family involved the police or made a mistake. What followed was an investigation that would stretch across weeks, involve local authorities and the FBI, examine nearly 2 million handwriting samples, identify Angelo John LaMarca, recover Peter's body, and ultimately lead to a conviction and execution. Yet the most important way to understand the case is not as a story of an ingenious criminal or even as a triumph of forensic investigation. It is the story of a child whose life was taken and of the extraordinary effort required to discover what had happened to him. The first lesson of the case is the importance of time. The FBI's formal involvement in certain kidnapping cases could be delayed for 7 days when there was no indication that the victim or suspect had crossed state lines. Peter disappeared on July 4th, and the FBI officially entered the case on July 11th. During those days, the kidnapper communicated with the family, ransom exchanges were attempted, and valuable time passed without the federal resources that would eventually become available. The case demonstrated the uncomfortable reality that legal procedures designed for one set of circumstances can become dangerously restrictive when circumstances change. A kidnapping is not an event that waits for administrative schedules. A missing child may be moved, abandoned, harmed, or killed within a very short period. The Weinberger case became part of the reason for changing that approach. President Dwight D. Eisenhower subsequently signed legislation reducing the waiting period from 7 days to 24 hours. That change represented a clear recognition that kidnapping investigations require speed. The lesson was not complicated. When a child disappears, authorities need the ability to act quickly. The second major lesson came from the handwriting investigation. At the beginning, the ransom note seemed to offer investigators only a limited clue. It contained words and instructions, but it did not identify the writer. There was no known suspect whose handwriting could immediately be compared with it. The second message, discovered after another failed ransom attempt, provided additional writing and was determined to have been created by the same person. That gave investigators a consistent sample, but they still faced the problem of identifying the writer. Their solution was extraordinary in scale. Nearly 2 million handwriting samples were examined, 1,974,544 in total. The number is significant not simply because it is large, but because it demonstrates the investigative problem the authorities were facing. They were looking for one person without knowing his name. Instead of beginning with an individual and testing his handwriting, they began with handwriting and search for the individual. Eventually, a sample at the U.S. Probation Office in Brooklyn attracted attention because of similarities to the ransom communications. The name attached to that handwriting was Angelo John LaMarca. From that moment, the investigation became more focused. LaMarca was no longer an anonymous figure. Investigators could examine his circumstances and question him directly. He was about 31 years old, lived in Plainview, Long Island, was married, and had 2 children. His work involved taxi coordination and truck driving. He was also experiencing serious financial difficulties, including debts and unpaid bills, and was under pressure from a loan shark. His background included involvement in alcohol smuggling and a previous Treasury Department arrest. These details did not prove that he had kidnapped Peter, but they provided a possible context for the $2,000 ransom demand. The most disturbing element of LaMarca's account was how Peter had apparently been selected. According to his later statement, LaMarca had been driving around Westbury while desperately seeking money. He passed the Weinberger home and saw Betty place her infant son in the baby carriage. Peter, according to this account, was not the result of a carefully researched target selection. He was simply the child LaMarca happened to see. That possibility makes the case particularly difficult to comprehend. There was no known relationship between LaMarca and the Weinberger family that explained the kidnapping. There was no indication that Peter had been selected because his parents were prominent or exceptionally wealthy. The family was middle class. The ransom amount itself was $2,000. The crime therefore appeared to arise from opportunity and desperation rather than from a long-term plan directed at a particular family. After LaMarca was arrested on August 23rd, he initially denied involvement. But confronted with the handwriting evidence, he eventually confessed. His confession led investigators to the area where he said he had left Peter. On August 24th, authorities searched the location. A diaper pin was found, followed by Peter's body. The discovery was devastating, but it also provided the final physical evidence needed to establish what had happened to the missing infant. The precise circumstances of Peter's death could not be reconstructed completely. The condition of his remains made that difficult. Forensic testimony referred to suffocation, starvation, and exposure, with suffocation described as the principal cause. LaMarca stated that Peter was alive when he abandoned him, but that statement did not establish that the child died immediately. The available information indicated that Peter may have survived for some period after being left alone. That uncertainty is one of the most painful aspects of the case because it leaves unanswered questions about Peter's final moments. LaMarca's statements about possible accomplices created additional uncertainty. He implicated Joe Parisi, who was arrested, but later admitted that he had given Parisi's name to cause trouble for him. He also mentioned someone called Shorty, whom investigators could not identify. These claims demonstrated that even after his confession, LaMarca's statements could not simply be accepted without verification. The strongest evidence remained the handwriting, the confession, and the information that led authorities to Peter. The legal proceedings followed quickly. LaMarca was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder on August 29, 1956. On September 5th, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense sought to emphasize his mental condition and the financial pressures he had experienced. The trial began in Nassau County on November 5th. The jury found him guilty. He received a death sentence, formally imposed on December 14, 1956. LaMarca continued to appeal, but the conviction remained in place. On August 7, 1958, he was executed at Sing Sing prison. The execution closed the legal chapter, but it could never provide the outcome the Weinberger family had wanted from the beginning. Their son was not returned alive. The ransom was never exchanged for Peter. The investigation found the offender, but it could not save the child. That distinction is essential when evaluating the case. An investigation can be considered successful in identifying a perpetrator and establishing responsibility. But that does not mean the tragedy itself has been resolved. For Morris and Betty Weinberger, the central loss remained permanent. Their son had disappeared from an ordinary moment in their own home environment, and no legal judgment could restore him. The broader legacy of the case therefore exists alongside the personal tragedy rather than replacing it. The federal response changed. The 7-day waiting period was reduced to 24 hours, reflecting the importance of immediate action in kidnapping cases. The investigation demonstrated that handwriting examination could be used on an enormous scale, and the case became an example of how investigators can work from an unusual piece of evidence when traditional leads are absent. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is simpler. A child does not need to belong to a wealthy or famous family to become the victim of a devastating crime. Peter's family was ordinary. Their lives were changed forever because one person, according to his own later account, happened to see an infant outside a home and decided to take him. That randomness is what makes the case so unsettling. There is no comforting explanation that makes Peter's disappearance seem predictable. The crime was not prevented by the fact that his family was ordinary, and the investigation could not undo the consequences once the kidnapping had occurred. The case remains a reminder of the vulnerability that can exist within seemingly safe surroundings, and of the importance of responding quickly when a child disappears. Yet it is also a reminder of what determined investigation can accomplish. The authorities began with an empty carriage and a handwritten demand. They followed the writing through 1,974,544 samples. They found a name. They confronted the suspect. They obtained a confession. They followed his directions. They recovered Peter. They secured a conviction. And the legal consequences ultimately extended beyond Lamarca himself. The story of Peter Weinberger, therefore, contains both failure and achievement. The greatest failure was the loss of Peter's life. The greatest investigative achievement was identifying the person responsible despite an extraordinary lack of conventional evidence. The greatest institutional consequence was the recognition that federal kidnapping investigations needed to move faster. More than 6 decades later, the details remain difficult to hear because the central victim was so young. Peter had lived for only about 1 month before he was taken. His entire life was measured in weeks. Yet his disappearance became part of American legal and investigative history. The case demonstrated that a handwritten note could become a forensic fingerprint of sorts, that millions of records could be searched for a single connection, and that laws governing kidnapping could change when experience exposed their weaknesses. But history should not allow the investigative achievements to overshadow Peter himself. He was not merely the subject of a famous kidnapping case. He was a son. He was a 1-month-old child whose parents expected to watch him grow. On July 4th, 1956, those expectations were destroyed. The carriage remained where it had been placed. The note remained beside it, but Peter was gone. Years later, the man responsible was dead, the conviction was final, and the law had changed. Still, none of those things could restore the future Peter had lost. That is the final meaning of the Weinberger case. It is a story about evidence, persistence, law, and forensic investigation. But above all, it is a story about the irreversible consequences of one act of violence. The investigation eventually answered the questions of who, where, and how. It could not answer the question that mattered most to his parents. What might Peter's life have become if he had simply been allowed to grow up? That future can never be known. What remains is the record of what happened, the lessons drawn from it, and the memory of a child whose disappearance forced a nation to reconsider how quickly it must respond when someone is taken. Peter Weinberger's life was tragically short, but the changes prompted by his case lasted far beyond it. His name remains attached not to the person who kidnapped him, but to a moment in American history when investigators, lawmakers, And the public were confronted with a painful truth. When a child disappears, there may be no time to wait. And sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can be the path to the truth.